Hi! Welcome to the second segment in this two-part episode about the Almanac Singers and the beginnings of the American folk revival movement. In the first part, we looked at some of the early murmurings of revivalism in America, and we met the young Pete Seeger. In this part, we'll see how Pete went on to found the Almanac Singers, and ultimately to become the major figure in this movement. Beginning where we left off, with his very first concert appearance at the Grapes of Wrath benefit concert in March of 1940. I'm Peter, and this is We Need to Talk About Music. It was an inauspicious beginning to Pete's concert career. Being part of such an elite roster made him so nervous that he forgot some of the words, but he did hit it off with another one of the performers, a former Los Angeles radio star named Woody Guthrie, who had come east after losing his job for getting too political for the sponsors. Guthrie was a hard-living cowboy type who had initially come to California as a Dust Bowl refugee, leaving a wife and 3 children back in Texas. He was also a bit of a musical savant who seemed to remember every song that he ever heard and had a knack for refashioning their lyrics to match whatever he wanted to sing about, like a kind of leftist Weird Al Yankovic. Pete, a city kid who neither drank nor smoked and could come across as a bit stiff and reserved when not performing, seemingly had little in common with Woody other than politics. But that didn't seem to matter. Pete wanted to learn from Woody's knowledge and experience, and Woody really liked having a good accompanist around, and probably also enjoyed the admiration. They started to travel together, hitchhiking and hopping freight trains, both of which were new and exciting experiences for the relatively sheltered Pete. After they made it down to Texas, Pete headed out on his own, working his way back to his hometown of New York, supporting himself playing his banjo for tips in bars. Once back, he met Lee Hayes, an Arkansas preacher's son who had transitioned his religious zeal from the church to the labor movement, and his friends, a writer named Millard Lampell and an accordion-playing union organizer named Sis Cunningham. The 4 of them moved into a 3-story row house in Greenwich Village, which was, believe it or not, an affordable thing to do at the time. They called it Almanac House, a name suggested by Hayes, and it quickly became a center of bohemian life in the neighborhood, serving as a crash pad for musicians, intellectuals, and activists who were passing through. It was also the site of Sunday afternoon sing-alongs they called hootenannies, or simply hoots. They only stayed in the house until 1943, but the hoots, transferred to other apartments and to Washington Square Park, were the beginning of a continuous tradition that formed the heart of the village folk scene all the way up through its heyday in the early 1960s. Working together in this heady atmosphere, they developed a style that took advantage of Pete's knowledge of traditional musics, Lampell's literary aptitude, Hayes' preacherly song-leading ability, and Hayes and Cunningham's experience with labor songs. After playing together casually for a while to hone their sound, they decided to take their show on the road, sometimes expanding to include Woody Guthrie, Bess Lomax, and others. Soon they had become a regular and in some circles well-known feature at strikes, rallies, and demonstrations, even playing at least once for First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. The Almanacs weren't the first performers to be associated with the folk revival, but there was definitely something different about them. For one thing, they performed in regular work clothes, something that was pretty much unheard of in an era when professional musicians wore formal wear on stage as a matter of course. For another, they just had a broader picture of what folk music was, or what it could be, than any previous revivalist had had. In the early days, the more academic, song-collecting side of the folk revival was primarily concerned with ballads, which in this sense means slow, melodic, often unaccompanied, and usually tragic story songs that were an important part of the British folk music tradition. Partly as a result of that, early folk revival singing also tended to be slow, melodic, and plaintive. The Almanacs, by contrast, were far more tuned in to dance music, due to Pete's already considerable experience as a square dance accompanist, and due in part to sometime member Woody Guthrie's encyclopedic musical memory, and in part to a summer that Pete and Bess had spent assisting Alan Lomax in compiling a catalog of folk and folkish music that had been commercially released on records, they were aware of a far more diverse array of styles and song types than any previous revivalist could have been reasonably expected to know. The result was a rhythmically exciting, vibrant, and varied sound that had echoes of a lot of traditional music styles without sounding exactly like any of them. Some people took notice, and it wasn't long before they had their first opportunity to go into the recording studio. This is where things get a little bit complicated. So I think before I go on, I should say a thing or two about the Communist Party of the United States of America and its parent company, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. These days, it's pretty rare to hear people on the left side of the aisle throw the term communism around, and there are good reasons for that. The information we now have about the history of people doing terrible things in its name is so overwhelming that most people are much more likely to associate the term with authoritarian violence than with radical egalitarianism. It's worth remembering, though, that in the years leading up to World War II, the situation was somewhat different. Then, as now, a lot of people in the U.S., including the Almanac Singers and pretty much everyone in their social circle, had grave concerns about the way their country was being run, especially where the issues of workers' rights and racial and gender equality were concerned. To a lot of those people, it seemed like the Communist Party was the only major force in politics that truly acknowledged the severity of these issues or showed any real inclination to do anything about them. Had they known more about what was really going on in the Stalinist Soviet Union, it almost certainly would have changed their impressions, but the fact is that they didn't. Very little good information about conditions behind the Iron Curtain were available at the time, especially to people who didn't speak Russian. And what truth there was buried under mountains of pro- and anti-communist propaganda. The Soviet Union also did a very good job of presenting a sanitized image of their state. Invited guests like singer, actor, and activist Paul Robeson and Roosevelt's second vice president Henry Wallace were treated to a manufactured utopia that was so convincing that Robeson even decided to send his son to school there. As for the Almanac Singers themselves, although some of them, including Pete, seem to have been members at one time or another, they were all basically a bit too free-spirited to go all in on party doctrine. They fit better into the category of fellow travelers, people who sympathized with and were willing to work with the party, but from outside. But work with them they absolutely did. This was the time of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a secret agreement between Nazi Germany and the USSR that allowed the Germans to invade Poland and do pretty much whatever they wanted, as long as they left the Soviets alone. The American Communist Party played along with this by arguing that the war raging in Europe and elsewhere was just an argument between plutocrats who were willing to sacrifice the lives of millions of ordinary people for the sake of their profits. The almanacs bought into this argument, and so anti-war messages became a major focus of their songwriting. In the spring of 1941, after raising $300 with a party at the Almanac House, they went into the studio to record their first album. And when I say album, remember that a record at the time only held about 2 songs, so we are literally talking about an album of records. The result was Songs for John Doe, a heartfelt collection of songs that lamented the horrors of war and pulled no punches in accusing President Roosevelt of being willing to sacrifice American lives on the altar of capitalism. It really was an exciting piece of work, and quite unlike anything I'm aware of that had come before. But its timing could hardly have been any worse. Just about a month after the album was released, in what would ultimately be one of the costliest moves in history in terms of human lives, Hitler predictably double-crossed Stalin and initiated a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Overnight, the Communist Party's position on U.S. involvement in the war completely reversed, and all unsold copies of the album were destroyed. This was a big setback for the Almanac Singers, and one that would come back to haunt them later, but they weren't ready to give up quite yet. They followed up John Doe almost immediately with Talking Union, an album that combined songs from the history of the labor movement with original takes on the same subject. Talkin' Union would be the album that really cemented the legacy of the Almanac Singers, and 2 songs from it in particular would go down as essentially the foundational text of the folk revival. One of them was Union Maid, a song Woody Guthrie was commissioned to write for the Women's Auxiliary of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO labor union. They famously looked a gift horse in the mouth, rejecting the song for failing to mention the words Women's Auxiliary in the lyrics, in an anecdote that Pete Seeger would endlessly repeat on stage for the rest of his career. The other was the title track, Talking Union, a veritable instruction manual for labor organizers that began as an attempt by Hayes and Lampell to add a few extra verses to an earlier song from Woody Guthrie, Talkin' Dust Bowl Blues, which was itself a reworking of a hillbilly song from the 1920s called Talkin' Blues. Made up of rhythmically spoken verses, each with a comedic tag at the end, the Talking Blues made a perfect template for writing songs that were light and funny but packed a lot of content. Guthrie, who never looked a gift horse in the mouth, recorded at least 7 different variations on it. Since then, it's become a kind of standard form for topical songwriting, and it was a particular favorite of the young Bob Dylan, who wrote and recorded at least 6 of his own. By the end of 1941, they had recorded 2 more albums of non-political traditional songs, one of sea shanties and whaling ballads, and one of songs from the American frontier. Both these albums were produced by Alan Lomax, and they seem to have been recorded primarily as a favor to him. So they kind of lack the fire of the other albums, but they're still well worth a listen. Meanwhile, on December 7, 1941, the question of whether or not the U.S. would get involved in the war was pretty decisively settled. Soon after, the Almanacs went back into the studio to record what would be their final album, Dear Mr. President. It's pretty much the opposite of Songs for John Doe, a stirring and emotional affirmation of the importance of a communal and cooperative war effort, in which soldiers and workers, men and women, and even rich and poor, all work together to deliver the goods. It's a fascinating time capsule of this really emotionally fraught moment in American history. The album's title track, yet another reworking of the Talking Blues, features Pete Seeger in the guise of a folksy everyman, speaking directly to President Roosevelt. He states the central position of the album, that even though none of the old issues have gone away, winning the war has to take priority. He wants to fight, he says, not because America is perfect, but because he wants to build a better America with better laws, and better homes and jobs and schools. And no more Jim Crow, and no more rules like you can't ride this train because you're a Negro. You can't live here because you're a Jew. You can't work here because you're a union man. None of this, he acknowledges, can be accomplished unless Hitler is defeated, and so he's ready to make sacrifices to see that happen. In one particularly dad-jokey moment, he even offers to stop fighting with his mother-in-law, because we need her too to win the war. Other highlights included the sinking of the Reuben James, a haunting account of Nazi Germany's first sinking of an American ship, featuring one of Pete's most moving vocal performances. And Round and Round Hitler's Grave, a frenetic revenge fantasy to the tune of a children's song that even got the group featured on a national radio program. Dear Mr. President was obviously intended as an olive branch, and it may almost have been an effective one. I don't know if FDR was particularly interested in folk music, but there's evidence that Eleanor Roosevelt was, and she was certainly at least aware of the Almanac Singers. It would be interesting to see what may have come of it had the nation accepted their offer to team up against fascism. Unfortunately, though, the extremely long-serving FBI director J. Edgar Hoover, who was famously at least as interested in cracking down on dangerous communist infiltrators like Martin Luther King Jr., John Lennon, Gene Kelly, Ernest Hemingway, Frank Sinatra, Jane Fonda, Muhammad Ali, Charlie Chaplin, and even Eleanor Roosevelt herself, as he was in fighting crime, had already made up his mind that the Almanac Singers were the enemy. Already back in September, an article had been published in Time magazine accusing them of being communists. More articles followed, and before long it became so difficult for them to find gigs that they stopped performing altogether, and soon after went their separate ways. Pete stood by the promise he'd made in Dear Mr. President and spent the remainder of the war in the Army, where he served honorably despite being kept out of combat due to his political leanings and the fact that he had become engaged to Toshi Oda, a half-Japanese-American square dancer to whom he would be married for the next 70 years. The FBI and later also the House Un-American Activities Committee would continue to hound him for decades, even coming very close to sending him to prison for contempt of Congress. Somehow, though, they were unable to stop him from quietly leading a revolution that continues to affect the way we all enjoy music today, whether we're aware of it or not. That'll have to be a story for another episode, though, because I've already talked way too long in this one. I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to say about the Almanac Singers and the beginning of the folk revival, or at least that you've learned something. And I especially hope that you enjoy the music. I'll be back again soon with something completely different. Until then, stay healthy and happy, and don't forget to listen to some music now and then.